Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just noticing a few more people are still waiting to join, so I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes before we actually make a start. So just bear with us. Thank you very much. Hello again, everybody. I'm still seeing quite a few people still joining us, so give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started. Thanks for your patience. Okay, hello everybody. We'll make a start. I'm sure there'll be more people joining us as we kind of go through the introductions, but that's great. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon to our webinar regarding privileged access management and particularly dealing with DSPT compliance. Just by way of some housekeeping, we're going to obviously go through the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a small survey. If you wouldn't mind just filling that in for us, that's really helpful, kind of helps us hone these and get these more accurate in terms of your expectations. And if you've got any questions, please put them in the question box and then we will deal with them at the end of the webinar. In terms of introductions, I'm Chris Booth from IT Health. I'll be dealing with the first part of the presentation, and then going to hand over to Kev Pearce, who's going to do some responses, and then we're going to hand over to Tom Hills, who's going to show us a really helpful demonstration of the Assyrium solution. For those of you that don't know anything about IT Health and who we are, we've been involved specifically within the NHS now for nearly 30 years, dealing with cybersecurity, access management, and kind of allied solutions. And within that, we have a number of different areas that we kind of specialize in. And those are on the screen now in terms of secure remote working, two-factor authentication, end user protection, network defense, workflow optimization, and then that compliance, governance, and assurance piece. We work with a number of leading edge suppliers, most on the screen, you can see on the screen today. Happy to talk to you about those anytime, but clearly today we're going to be focusing in on our colleagues and our solutions from Assyrium around that privileged access management piece. I said we've been working in the NHS now exclusively for roughly 30 years, and alongside those solutions, we really pride ourselves in terms of the skills that we have and the experience that we've built up over that time. We'd like to say it's our team that stand out. We've got people who've been working in the business for 25 years or so. Myself, I've been with the company for 10 years, so a lot of experience understanding your needs and what you need to do and what you're trying to achieve and how these solutions kind of fit into that piece and dealing with the vulnerabilities that we face today in a fairly critical market. Turning our attention to privileged access management and most recently the National Cybersecurity Centre review that came out a couple of weeks ago now, and there were some very clear things within that kind of spoke into the content that we want to talk about today. So in terms of what we're seeing on the screen right now, number one, a change in ransomware behaviour, and preventing access to your data can be a real problem. So key thing there is in protecting your data, and then a shift towards threatening to publish that compromised data. And obviously, from a ransom point of view, that's a really big issue. So again, we're into protecting systems there and making sure those backup strategies are in place and recoveries in place. And then obviously having that plan in place and making sure that administrator users and their privileges are protected and managed. And that management of privileged access is really what we want to focus in on today. And they really do have an impact in terms of what goes on around things like Cyber Essentials Plus and DSPT in terms of that toolkit piece, which seems to get more and more complex in terms of completing that on a week-by-week basis almost. In addition to that, the national security standards of those 10 data guardian standards, we see here that Security Standard 4 makes a very clear statement about least privilege. And again, we want to look into that and how that works. I should have said earlier, this will be recorded, so you don't need to make any notes. We'll make sure everybody gets a copy of the presentation. Turning more focus onto the DSPT, that has some very clear statements in kind of section 4, 441, 2, 3, 4, and 5 around how you manage those privileged user access requirements, and states very clearly what the expectations are there of organisations and kind of what we need to do. So we'll touch on those in more detail. And in addition to that, Cyber Essentials Plus, which is now becoming part of that DSPT requirement as well, talks again into managing accounts, removing those accounts that are not required, changing default passwords, and then further down, restricting privilege access to the right number of authorized individuals, documenting those processes as you go through that process. So we clearly see there's quite a few challenges that are facing us on a day-to-day basis in terms of managing this privileged access. And what we wanted to try to do is encapsulate that really into a single slide of the things that we know that we face in working with some of you, and those challenges that you face on a day-to-day basis, which we're going to address in a second. And we kind of boiled it down into these key ones here, these being protecting access to domain admin accounts, local password administration services, protection of that third-party access, for organisations like ourselves coming in to manage your systems and help you support those, recording and auditing of admin third-party activity, then approval of workflow, whether that be internal or external, protecting and controlling those backup admin accounts, and then an interesting one again, automating tasks and approvals, and managing all of that is a complex process. But what we're hopefully going to show you over the next hour or so is how we can address that, how we can help you manage that, how we can take out that labor-intensive resource requirement that's required when we all know it's a busy time given the current situation. But generally, anyway, these are tasks that can be improved upon and automated. I'm going to hand over now to Kev, who's going to take us through some of the responses to these challenges that we've just set out. Over to you, Kev.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. So yeah, one of the key things with PAM and achieving all this level of security is being able to have some level of granularity and having a level of control of what's going on. And the phrase here on the slide on the left, the being able to control the right privilege to the right people at the right time, really is a key phrase and a key statement to all of this. It's about knowing what's gone on in your systems, who's connected to what, being able to prove and be able to audit what's been done, to know who has the access to go and make connections to do it, and know who has access into the future. So you know what's going on with the people who are then accessing those systems. Now, they could be internal staff, they could be third-party staff. One of the key features of PAM is to be able to know that any credentials that are being used are not potentially at risk. So being able to separate the connections that come in and being able to control what they can do. So call it least privilege, call it separation of duties. There's a variety of different terms, but organizations that are running just a single account model will struggle. a single account where IT staff are logging onto a workstation, opening their email, browsing the internet, using an account which has privileges across the network, maybe even up to that domain admin level. That's the risky place to be. The goal is to separate out the accounts for what they're used for. So being able to separate what is a normal user, what is a privileged user, then being able to identify what specific functions and actions people might need to be able to perform. And that might be something that could be automated and turned into individual tasks and not be reliant on full administrative connections to systems. If it can't be turned into a task, then maybe we need to allow just access to a specific application and the level of granularity to be able to control who can access what application at the right time. Ultimately, you're still going to have a need at some point for root or full administrator access. You're going to need to control that highest level of privilege, but being able to do that in a controlled fashion, to be alerted when people are making those connections, or even putting some kind of approval in, so that you have to, if you want to make a connection to a system, you have to get approved. And then having recordings and the knowledge of what was done in those connections, being able to prove what happened. So PAM is very much about being able to build these layers and being able to put this approach into the way that you control privileged access and the way it's used across systems. Now, the idea of separating users from passwords is a key part of this. Going back to one of Chris's earlier slides talking about the NCSC report, there have been some shifts in modern times into the way attacks and cyber breaches happen. Passwords are no longer guessed or brute forced. These days, they're stolen. You steal credentials and then you just use a credential and have access to a system. Now, it may be that those credentials are vulnerable and can be stolen from yourselves, typically at the workstation. So being able to separate those credentials away from the workstation and make sure that there's no privileged access available at that workstation is a key thing. But also the fact that those credentials could be stolen from somewhere else. It could be some other database somewhere across the internet, but because passwords may have been reused, that makes you vulnerable, even though it's not your data or your credentials that have been stolen. But if there's a set of credentials out there on the internet that happens to have some NHS email addresses and some passwords tagged against them, then people are going to try them, and they're going to try them against NHS services and resources. So these two things are very key to what we can achieve with PAM. So if we can move on to the next slide, Chris. Thank you. So this idea of separating the users from the access that they have is what we're about. What Assyrium does is it identifies the user coming in, so we know who they are. Now that may be based on their network identity, their group memberships. We can add multi-factor authentication into that to add that kind of strong authentication factor. But once we've identified the user, we then offer them the ability to connect to a specific set of systems or gain access to resources. I'm not sure if that slide's continuing to build or not, Chris. Finished at the moment. Anyway, there we go. So what Assyrium PAM is all about is being able to take that user coming in and offer them the ability to connect on to the services and the target devices that they need to manage through a variety of different mechanisms. Now, it could be full administrative access. It could be RDP, SSH connections, browser connections to do full administrative duties. It can also be, as I mentioned on the previous slide, about controlling individual applications. You may only want database support providers to come in and use database tools. You don't want them to have access to the full server and have underlying access to an operating system. So that's where the map server component within PAM comes in, and that allows us to share individual applications while still providing a single sign-on mechanism. So like we do for the RDP and the SSH connections, we can provide single sign-on so that the end user making the connection doesn't know and has no knowledge at all of the credentials being used. They're being injected by PAM into that connection flow and then presented back to them. All the user has is a browser that they just open up, make the connection, and everything is then contained and isolated within that browser. So no dependency on local tools or local installations, nothing is saved or cached locally, and that gives that protection from the data being leaked to the endpoint because it's all contained within the browser. As well as those individual applications being shared, we can then also go into the automation space with the tasks that are shown on here, and that's where we can take the repeatable known actions that people need to do, and instead of giving them the full administrative access with a dangerous high-level account, we can provide automated tasks that do that job for them. And that can build up a whole tool set and a suite of tasks that could be offered to help desk staff or external third parties that then may even in some scenarios remove the need for the privileged access at all and take away that full OS and root level access. So it's all about building up those granular levels, but also at the same time having full visibility of what's going on. So whether people are coming in and sharing a generic account, PAM still gives you the visibility of who used which account when. So that kind of gives you the historical aspect. The current state of play is you see the configuration, you see who's allowed to access what, where they can go in the future. You can see what people are doing right now. The session recordings can also be live monitored, so you can see what's happening with connections that are going onto systems. And if you don't like something that a third party is doing, you could terminate the connection and have that level of control of the connections. If we want to step on to the next slide, Chris. Thank you. So in terms of the compliance aspect, yes, there are a lot of references to controlling privileged access. There are lots of references to third parties and things like default passwords and making sure that things have been configured and aren't just being run out of the box. And that pans across the data security and protection toolkit as well as Cyber Essentials. So I've been involved in our own Cyber Essential audits, and I know just how many times the word password or privilege comes up within Cyber Essentials. So it's quite an emphasis on it. What we do with PAM is we take away a lot of that headache, and by automating some of the lifecycle management of the accounts, managing the passwords, having the audit trail, you get a lot of ticks across a lot of boxes within these compliance areas showing exactly what's happening on your network. You have the proof, you have the evidence, you have the audit trail, and you have the ability to control it going forward. Now, PAM projects are all about visibility, they're all about knowing what's going on, but then they turn into control, and then they turn into be able to limit the access and control exactly what's going on and have that full 360-degree view and control of what's going on across the setup. So that's enough of me rabbiting on. What I'll do now is I'll hand over to Tom, and Tom can give us a bit of a demo and show you a few of the workflows and how you use PAM.
So thanks for that, Clive. I'm just going to pass the control over to Tom. There you go, Tom.
Thank you. You should be seeing my demonstration environment. Chris, can you confirm? Perfect.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Good afternoon, guys. So I've been left with a little bit extra time, which is never a bad thing in terms of running through the demo. So I may spend around about 20 or so minutes on a demo of the PAM solution, covering it from a number of angles. So we may have a look at certainly one or maybe two different user views within PAM, just to see what different users with different levels of access can actually achieve and what they can do. And then we'll have a look at the back end whilst tying into the DSP toolkit to make this relevant to how we can help achieve against the toolkit, and looking at things like the audit trail, the session recording, and also having a look at the actual account management themselves. So in order to access PAM as a user, whether you're internal to the organization or whether it's a third party, the access is all derived over a browser, as you can see. So there's no thick client tools or anything I need to deploy on my workstation. The experience is the same whether I am internal or external, as long as I have browser access. So in this environment, I'm following the recommendation that Kev was discussing around splitting out that access to having access to one non-privileged user, which I'll be using to authenticate with, and I have access to a number of different named privileged accounts and some other type of accounts in here as well. So as I said, I'm logging in with my AD or with my AD user. Active Directory is often administrated already quite heavily and is often the source of truth in terms of group memberships for access to other applications. So we can just hook into Active Directory and all of the access can be controlled via AD group memberships. The token code box here is for MFA integration. So that may be something for the future or something that you're already thinking about. If you wanted specific users to go through a multi-factor step, they can enter a token code in that box, or we can send push notifications, SMS messages with codes in, those types of scenarios. So once the user logs in, depending on their profile membership, which is almost like a policy or almost like a secure container on the back end where access is configured, the access to the devices will then be displayed to the user here. So on the very first instance, I can scroll through and just see some types of devices I can access. So for example, I can access the corporate AWS or Azure platform over Chrome as a browser using a corporately controlled and perhaps managed privileged account. I can connect to some Windows-centric devices and also use RDP and maybe some Windows apps and Windows admin tools. I've got access to some other systems here if we just quickly scroll down. So some more RDP in there. I've got access to some Unix-based devices, whether it's a server or whether it's a networking appliance over both SSH or in fact HTTPS for the GUI of a network appliance. In addition as well, I could even have a recorded SFTP connection to monitor who's copying files onto critical servers. But for these servers that are grayed out, you can see that I need to actually submit a request for approval before I can gain access, which puts a bit of power into perhaps some maybe team managers or IT security managers or those types of individuals, or if it's an internal sysadmin who's working in partnership with a third party can come in and put in whatever ticket it is they have maybe for an internal ticket, or simply providing some more workflow around controlling why somebody is actually requesting access if you don't want them to have access 24/7. And with using these systems, I'm using the local account that resides on that server that we will have discovered, as well as potentially being able to use a privileged domain account. So a few types of different examples there and types of access. But one thing I did really want to quickly mention before we actually start interacting with those systems is focus on the actual usability of the user. So we make the devices able to be searched, which is pretty simple and pretty straightforward, as we kind of demonstrate here. Search via host name, maybe search via device name, maybe search via IP address, if you're able to memorize IP addresses. That is, I started my career in network support. Unfortunately, I wasn't blessed with the ability to memorize IP addresses. But what happens if you've got hundreds or thousands of devices and you need to find a device that you're looking for quickly? With Cerium, you're able to configure metadata-based searching, which is a really powerful feature and one of our main differentiators in that you're able to categorize your devices in terms that are relevant to the users that use these devices on a regular basis. So whether you want to group devices by location to make them easier to find, as you can see here, or maybe potentially split them out into areas in a network, as you can see. So you'll start to then able to customly categorize your own devices with metadata that's relevant to yourselves. So the first example we'll take a look at is connecting to a domain controller, which is a pretty common example in that it's a critical piece of infrastructure, but not necessarily everyone needs to have direct access to that domain controller. So we'll take you through a couple of examples here. So on the screen, I can see that my user has been set up to have, in the first instance, RDP access using their own _ADM account. I could even use the local administrator account on that machine. And by the way, these are accounts that are having their password cycled on a time basis by the PAM platform. But tying back into that account lifecycle piece and actually providing temporary access, you could in fact provision a user to have role-based access. And this is again another unique differentiator for Cirium, in that if you're getting to a stage where you may start to want to reduce the number of privileged accounts that are sat around in the wild at any one time, or maybe a third party's connecting in and they do need, for some reason, file system access to the server, but you only want them to be able to administrate DNS, for example. The PAM solution will actually automatically create and manage the passwords of those accounts and actually limit the privilege that the accounts have at the target end, which again, in theory, you're achieving least privilege. And the reason why these accounts are temporary is that when that user is added to that profile or is granted that access, the accounts are then created. They can use them. If you couple it in further with the workflow approval, that paints a really nice security story in that the user has access for a specific amount of time with an account that has its privileges limited automatically by PAM. But then maybe once that user's workflow expires, they then may be offboarded from PAM if they're a third party. Any accounts that the PAM solution creates are automatically deleted when the user's offboarded. So if you're looking to achieve a just-in-time temporary access with least privilege wrapped in there as well, I certainly recommend taking advantage of some of the automated role-based access control that we can provide. But we'll bring it back to just using something like an underscore ADM account. Now, as you'll notice, this session is establishing within my browser. And because I'm recording the session and I've configured the terms of use, the user needs to accept the fact they're going to be recorded. You can, of course, remove that terms of use and have the session recorded anyway without the user having to acknowledge that. But that's certainly true for certain audit requirements. Stipulate that the users need to be made aware that they're being recorded. So what's happened here is that, as you can see, this is a session that's been established within my browser. This session is encrypted, first of all, as this is an RDP connection going over an SSL connection in my browser. The PAM server itself has retrieved the credential, injected it into the session, and then effectively enabled the user to elevate their privileges from being tom.hills to now tom.hills_ADM in this secure session. A few benefits of why we're browser-based is that certain Windows-based PAM vendors out there may initiate a session from an RDP or a remote app file that gets dropped from the user's workstation, which is great, but if the user knows what they're doing, they're able to extract passwords, often in clear text, from these types of connections. And in addition as well, there's nothing really to stop any malware that may be running on that workstation from propagating to the target device. When we're running a browser-based connection, those types of risks are greatly mitigated. And I can prove that I am exactly who I say I am by running a command here. And in addition, this connection's also occurred over native ports and protocols. So our solution is completely agentless when connecting to devices. In addition, from user experience as well, we've got some actions along the top here, or some functions where I could send a Control-Alt-Delete remotely to the end device. I can also map a drive. If I'm working out of a change ticket, I can open that from here, and I can also have copy and paste stuff into the session and copy it out as well. And then once I'm finished, I'll sign out or log off as I normally would without having been exposed to the tom.hills_ADM credential, which is all very well and good. However, there may be certain scenarios, depending on the user's job function, that requires them to have access to just an application, where having direct access is maybe not be needed, maybe overprivileged. They could access something and data that they're not supposed to, and maybe make a mistake with something that's running on that server and cause a potential outage. What we're able to provide with our MAP server, which stands for Managed Application Proxy Server, which is just a Windows server that sits alongside PAM, is the ability to provide that tool-based access and just access to the tool. So talking around granting least privilege and only allowing users stuff that they need in order to do their job is where the MAP server can come in. So in this example, I could be a level 2 engineer in a help desk who may not need RDP, but still has some level of responsibility in that I'm just administrating the users of the domain. I don't need RDP to do that. You can simply grant me access to ADUC. I can come in here, and because of the privilege of the account that I'm using I can come in here and reset passwords and administrate the users of the domain. So with the map server, you can start to control how users connect to systems. I've got a few more examples of those types of sessions that I can show you. Notably, we may take a look at a web-based session. So if we open up a Chrome-based connection to the AWS console, a unique feature that Assyrium has is the ability for you to enable, or the ability to enable you to actually configure custom connections to web portals. So what you would do is select in Assyrium where the ports, or in fact the paths are on the website, and then once we actually detect that path being displayed by the website, we will actually send in the credential. So we detect the username and the password fields. Once they're displayed, credentials are then injected, and only then is keyboard and mouse access given to the user once that authentication has occurred. So if, for example, in here, if I'm coming into the AWS portal, I leave a machine running for 2 weeks and go off on holiday, from the audit trail that we'll see in PAM in a moment, we're able to prove that it was exactly me who did that, so that you can send me the invoice instead of paying for it out of the company pot. Some other examples that we can take a look at in terms of map functionality. One final example to take a look at could be SQL access, which again is something really prevalent that we see, especially where maybe access to patient data is required. You can allow a DBA to have access to just their database tool. In my case, I'm using SQL Server Manager Studio, but it could be Toad, it could be Oracle products. Doesn't necessarily matter the type of tool, but the example that we'll show you here will be somebody connecting to a database remotely without actually connecting to the operating system where that database is installed. Because if I had that access, I could just decide to stop and start the database service and again cause a potential outage. I might just need to rejig that connection. Not quite sure why that's just failed. Okay. So when you see the blue box indicated, that does let us know that we're going onto the map server. So we'll just wait for this connection to establish. And there we go. So we're connected remotely to the database. I'm able to query the database. By no means am I a DBA by trade, but if I am, then I can go and do whatever it is that I need to do within the actual tool itself without having operator system access to the system. Okay, there is one final piece of access to a system that we'll show you, and that's just SSH. So just get a feel of what SSH looks like. So I can connect to, I could even use read-only access to a firewall. So starting to make use of that role-based access there. But we'll just select this device. You'll see that this device session isn't actually recorded. So with Assyrium, you can certainly select which devices you do want to record based on the criticality within your infrastructure. So that's certainly an item that's configurable. And then from here, I can go in and do whatever it is I need to do in this particular device. Okay, we'll have a look at another tier of access now then, which is in fact the task-based automation. So access to a task could be granted to a user who may not need or require any form of access to the system. It could be a third party, it could be somebody who's a first-line engineer in a help desk, somebody that may not have the connectivity to the system, but you want that user to maybe become more productive and take care of maybe automating a task that is run on a frequent basis and save a bit of time, or enable the users to become a bit more productive. And it's the term that gets, what we're describing here is a shift left mentality. So if, for example, I could allow somebody to disable a domain account if they are simply not a domain admin, so, or have tool-based access either. So I would again select the task to run. However, this time I'm going to be presented with almost like a wizard-like approach where I'm going to have a conversation with the target system whilst not actually connecting out the other end to the system at all. So in here, I'm going to be prompted for the name of the account which I'm going to disable. In this case, it's called Disable Me. We know who this is because this is the ticket that's been raised in the ticket to our help desk. If, however, I'm running something like a a bulk change on a firewall, I can push this out to multiple devices at once, but we're just going to stick with the one server for now, and then we'll press execute. So what's happening on the back end is our PAM server is making a remote connection to the target device and running, in this case, a piece of PowerShell script to carry out the activity to disable the user. And in 4 seconds flat, that's been achieved. I've not had to pull out a privileged password from KeyPass and then connect on, or maybe even connect through a jump server, or even, as Kev mentioned, have one account that I would use to go straight through. We know that it's a Syrian PAM that's running this connection. It's either going to be a success or a failure. Me as the user, I'm not even exposed to the target device at this point, so I can come back and update my ticket and say, action carried out, close the ticket or whatever it is that I can go and do once this task is completed. So benefit of task management is it does save a lot of time and enables users to become a lot more productive without being overprivileged in carrying out these tasks. Another example could be restarting a service, often something that does require direct access to a system and require admin access on that system as well. How do you stop users from restarting the wrong service? I'm sure we've all done that by accident at some point in our time. With Assyrian, we were able to designate which services a user has access to restart. So I can only restart Windows Update. So if a ticket comes through to say Windows Update has failed, I can connect to the system and run the task as we're seeing now. And then we're able to successfully restart just that service. As we can see, 3 seconds flat there. These tasks are all available out of the box. And this is something that is also able to be customized as well. I have only really demonstrated some Windows-based tasks. I've got access to run some tasks on some Unix-based machines, but these can also span out to firewalls, network devices, switches, etc. And as I mentioned, these can be customized. So whether we're running PowerShell or whether we're running Python or whether we're running an API command to connect to a system, those are all within our remit to be able to customize those. So if there are tasks that you would wish you could automate, then that's certainly something that we can look to help you with. Okay, so I think from a user perspective, that covers what we were going to show you today. I'll just log in and show you a different user so you can kind of understand the different levels of access. If I log in as a user who I set up to be a remote third-party engineer, you'll see that I have significantly more restricted access than the previous user. So as you can see, I've logged in with a different user. I've only got access to 3 servers. I have to submit a ticket that needs to be approved in order to access all of them. And I'm only going to use a temporarily created an account that has the role of root instead of the actual root account, which I can see here. And this is all around our profile membership. And if a user's not in a profile, as you can see, this user is not in the AWS profile, not in the domain controller access. If you're not in a profile to access a device, you're not going to know that it exists. I'm going to move on now to being an admin of Assyrian. So we'll just log out these user sessions. I've got the admin console here. Just need to do a refresh. Oops, okay. So log in. So within the admin console, you only get access to this console if you are a super admin of the solution. So not every single user is going to have this type of view. But certainly within here, we'll take a look at the actual account management. We'll take a look at how the access is configured by means of the profile membership. And then we'll take a look at some of the monitoring of the user activity. And then we'll finish up with looking at some of the reports. So when you tell Assyrian about a device you wanted to manage, or whether you integrate with Active Directory, we'll then discover and report back on all of those privileged accounts. So whether they're local accounts, as we can see here, or whether they are in specific groups in Active Directory that we've told Assyrian we want it to manage, those accounts will then get pulled back to us. When they're first discovered, they're often given the state of unapproved, which means as security professionals, we need to decide whether this is an account that we want going through the PAM solution, or whether we want to delete it or disable it or whatever it is we want to do with it. So as well as being able to filter on these accounts, as you can see, we can filter by the states of the accounts, and we can also search for specific devices as well. But this account backdoor looks particularly suspicious to me. So what I can do is right click, and if this is a genuine account, I can simply change the state. Now, Assyrian works on different states of account management, which enables us to really help in providing a use case approach to our rollout, in that we may go ahead and say, I'll set this account as approved if it's might be a local break glass account, for example. I could set the password to known. If we know what the password is and we want people to be able to connect to the system using that account, but we don't want to manage the password immediately, then we might set the account to known. But ultimately, the end goal is to have that password set managed, whereby Assyrian is then going to take ownership of that account and then start to rotate that account on a time basis of your choosing, using a password that is as long and as complex as that device can physically handle, which means it will take computer programs years and years to crack if those passwords are long, secure, and complex. And really really does significantly reduce the risk of being vulnerable to a privileged credential-based attack. What I can also do is delete the account, which will delete the account from PAM and the target device as well. So the end goal will be that the account will be managed, where if we go into Active Directory, we've got a few on here. So I can see that I'm actually managing my _ADM account. And if we just prove that now, I will right click and reveal the credential, which is only possible if you have super admin rights to the platform, and also will generate syslog and email alerts as well when people are doing this. But I can see there that that is a long and secure password. So once we are starting to manage the credentials and we're telling Assyrian what the credentials are, by the way, the fully managed accounts here are the role-based accounts that Assyrian has created. So there's my DNS admin, just if you're wondering what the difference between managed and fully managed is. So ultimately, once we know what those passwords are, or once we're managing those accounts, we're able to grant access to users to those accounts in the profile. So the example that we looked at in the demo was access to a domain controller. So if we open up this profile, on a first instance, we can see that we're actually recording the sessions to devices in the profile. And we can also enable change ticket as a verification step for access in here as well. And we can also see if any users are set up to be approvers of requests for access. But if we go back to the profile, how we would read the profile is we have devices on the left and the level of access. So once the password is known for the administrator account, users can use that account. Or if you go one step above and start managing accounts, then those can be selected in here. Or if you've got a naming convention that's standard across the board, users like Tom.Hills can get mapped onto their corresponding ADM accounts, and that connection will be mapped to the user's ADM. Under the tools menu, you would select what tools you want the user to use. If you want them to use any, of course, you would simply just tick the box. Any change that you make in the profiles gets pushed to the users in real time. So if you then want to start deciding that RDP is overprivileged for those groups of users, you can remove it and it will be removed immediately from the users. Under the tasks, same again, to simply tick the tasks you want the users to be able to run. And then ultimately who those users are. So our PAM solution supports the ability to integrate with Active Directory. As you can see, I've told Assyrian PAM about some AD groups to be users of PAM. If we just drill down into that group, I'm the only user that's a member of that group in Active Directory. So I'll also be able to see all of the users that are a member of those AD-based groups. But you can also configure local users and local groups where you can start to automate access expiry and that kind of thing if you need to control third-party access especially. That's quite common to create local users for third-party access. So once we've onboarded the users, we've given them access, and this is what appears to the users in their user view. How do we see what they've been up to? And how do we actually start reviewing some of that monitoring data? This is captured under the device access report. And in here, I get a list of all of the access that's gone through PAM. So whether we're recording the session or not, we'll still capture the metadata about that session. So starts and end times of a session duration versus the actual active duration. Now, a Cerium session recording is unique in that we only capture when the user's actually active and actually interacting with that session. So if somebody's established a session and gone away to make a cup of coffee and they're away for 5 minutes, we're not going to record the 5 minutes of nothingness, which does make storage requirements a little bit easier as well. We'll also capture the standard, where they've connected to, who they are and where they've come from, what their account that they're using has come from, so whether it's AD based or whether it's a local account, what they've used to go out the other end. So again, that clear distinction of they were a user and now they're a privileged account or a role-based access, how they've connected, and additionally as well, if anyone's approved a request, we should have some examples of that in here. Maybe I've not done one of those for a little while. And also if they enter any change tickets in there as well, which is all very well and good. However, how do you really separate the wood from the trees in that if you detect that there's been an incident on a system that you know is under management from PAM, how do you start to review these recordings? Well, this is possible with the fuzzy filter. So in here, I'm going to enter the command that we ran previously. Who am I? And then we'll filter on all of the sessions where that command has been detected. And now I can filter this further on time, date and time ranges, as you can see. But for today's example, I know that this is the session from earlier on this afternoon. I can see that it was Tom that made this connection. So all we'll do is press play. In the interest of time, we'll just set the playback speed to fast and press play. Now this is only accessible if you are a super admin or auditor only access. So that's quite a useful one if you want to grant temporary audit access to an external or maybe even an internal auditor without having to grant them access directly through to PAM or provide that access themselves. You can provide that access to them themselves. If we just drag this forward a little bit, we're opening command prompt, and then at this point, we're actually entering that command in there. So you're able to really identify frame by frame the point in time when somebody has actually entered a command or ran a keystroke or whatever it is that they've been up to. There are some additional features with the session recording. You can export them off to, you can export the metadata to CSV. The product can be configured to send the recordings on a time basis to maybe a SAN or a NAS system if you need to keep them for longer periods of time. There is archiving, which you can configure. So I've set my archive up to every 60 days. We'll just archive off some of the old recordings. But if you need to keep them for longer periods of time, that is possible. And as I said, we can configure them to be sent off externally to another server in your environment. There is also session shadowing within the product as well. So if you're granting access to third parties, that could be over something like TeamViewer or WebEx, which may take somebody off of whatever it is they're doing to watch what that third party's up to. If you control their access and their privileges through PAM, you don't necessarily need to watch them constantly, but if there are concurrent sessions going through, you can shadow that if you wanted to kind of drop in and drop out every now and again. And also you will be able to terminate that session if you see that user doing something that they shouldn't be doing. The session data and the screen recordings are stored in an encrypted database which sits on the same server, meaning that these recordings are stored securely and they are completely tamper-proof. The final piece we'll take a look at the demo is the management report here. The management report really does provide the single pane of glass view into ultimately the success of PAM. And this is something that's often reviewed during initial rollout and often when the product's been in production for a number of years. The information that's captured in here is the account management coverage. And this is ultimately the percent of accounts that we're managing. So you can see from the previous screen in the accounts menu, we noted all of the accounts that were at their various different stages. Those are then displayed and reported in the dashboard here. So if there is a question of what value has PAM given me, that's clearly displayed here, and we can see the overall success in the number of accounts that we're managing. For a production environment, I would expect this to be anywhere between 85 to 100% of accounts being managed, purely just to allow some overhead for perhaps new users being onboarded, which require their own privileged accounts to be created, and the accounts then discovered and managed by PAM. But as I said, I expect that for a production environment to be anywhere between 85 to 100%, largely light green with maybe a smidge of dark green for any role-based temporary access that needs to be allowed for third parties connecting in. Also, state overview, as you can see, and also top tasks and top connections that people are making as well. As with any of our reports, can be exported and can be filtered on as well. As I already alluded to as well, in terms of monitoring, integration with SIEM and email is also possible, as well as is integrating with SNMP, so you can get real-time alerts and monitoring from the solution to further add value to the information that we're capturing. From the technical demo, that was all I had planned to share with you today. I think there are time for some questions now. So I'll stop sharing. Well, thank you for your attention this afternoon. It's been great to present to you. And I'll hand back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks very much. Just leave one, that's fine if you leave that screen up. Yeah, thanks everybody. We do have a few questions and I'm hoping that Tom or Kev can answer some of these for me because some of them are quite technical. So the first one is, can the MFA be geo-based? I assume that's geographically based. If on-site, not needed, but if off-site or VPN required.
So we can integrate with MFA if it's on-premise or cloud-based, I think is the approach that I'll take to answer that question. Maybe Kev might have something additional to add there.
Yeah, so we use Radius to talk to external MFA systems or services. So be that Azure MFA or Duo or some other form of multi-factor authentication. If those have geo awareness and they can grant the information to send down to PAM, then we can use that. So it's very much dependent on the MFA system that we're integrating with. We don't have that MFA on board built in. We leverage what organizations invariably already have and use that.
Okay, thank you very much. Second question is, how are service accounts managed? I'm not sure whether we covered that in the demo, but we can just touch back on that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So we're able to manage we're able to manage domain-based service accounts. So if a service account is on the domain, we'll be able to discover that service account, and we're also able to discover any dependencies or services as to where that account is being ran, so that if we update the password of the service account, we're also able to trigger restarts and things of the actual services and the dependencies. Again, I open that up if Kev's got anything to add on that point.
No, I think that's yes, we do cover service accounts. Just didn't get a chance to include it in our demo agenda today, but yes, they certainly are audited and managed as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Next question is, what sort of timeframes would you expect in terms of setting up correct account for a 100-person IT department?
That's a great question. Oh, yeah. Kev actually is probably the best place to answer that one.
That's right, Tom, thank you. So what we typically do is deploy PAM and mimic what the permissions and the roles are set up initially. So the start of a project would be mimicking the levels of access people have. That can be done in a relatively short space of time. That's maybe a week or 2 weeks to get the system up and running and identify all the existing permissions and roles. Then what PAM gives you is a lot of visibility into what people are doing, how they're using those accounts, which ones are needed, and then you can use that information to then start to tighten up the security and improve the posture of the organization. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's any longer than 2 weeks for a 100-man organization.
Okay, great stuff. Next question, Millie, there is, how is this licensed? Number of AD users, I can answer that question. It's licensed per server that you want to manage, and that can be with or without recording. So it's a case of looking at your estate, working out whether that's every server or specific servers. The great thing about that is it gives you a chance to scale. So you can start with a relative small number and grow that as time goes on, depending on budget, or if budget is not an issue, then you can go across everything if you want to. Anything you want to add to that, Kev?
Yeah, and the fact that we license by the target devices means that you're not going to be paying for additional numbers of users that are coming in from, say, third parties. So you can add groups of users from third parties, and that's not going to impact your licensing, which would be something that would be out of your control. So it's very much, the license is geared towards something that's in your control, i.e. the services that you want to protect.
Great stuff. And the last question, thanks very much for all the people who posed this, is it possible to run a proof of concept or something similar?
Yes, absolutely. We've got a few different approaches that we can offer. We have a cloud-based environment where if you wanted to have a look at a pre-configured environment for a week or so to kind of have a poke or a look around. There's also the ability to have a eval where we can give you access to download the software remotely, and if you want to kind of have a look at a test of that at your own time and your own pace, again, limited time availability of that environment, but that's more deploying on premise. Alternatively, you can have a fully scoped POC with somebody like myself, where we'll come out and we'll engage with yourselves to roll the product out with you, get it embedded into your environment, and then we can also provide some additional knowledge-based, knowledge transfer, and just kind of show you how to do initial things, onboarding users, onboarding devices, granting access, etc.
Great stuff. Thank you very much for that. So that brings us to the end. We've done it within the hour, which is always great news. So thank you to everybody for listening in, and I hope that's been really helpful for you. Thank you to our colleagues for presenting the content. Hopefully we've kind of set out the challenges and the responses in terms of how Assyrium can deal with those and how we can address those within the application as well. As I said, the session has been recorded, so we will be able to send those out to you over the coming days. If anybody's got any questions they want to pose back to us, then please do. And finally, please remember as you leave, there is the survey just to kind of fill in, which will be really helpful. But yeah, once again, thanks to everybody, and I wish you all the rest of you a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.